Hello everybody, today we're going to be going over our second Photoshop tutorial for our tips and tricks series. Today our goal for the video will be how to use various selection tools, making transformations and using the guides to help us do that, and a little bit on how to use the clone stamping tool to clean stuff up. By the end of this video, we're hopefully going to have an understanding of how I took this photograph and turned it into a digital sketch that I used to make a lithograph. All right, so the first thing we're gonna do is our selections. Our end goal here is to have only this board with the spoons, so we wanna get rid of the background. So we have a couple of options. We can either select the background that we want to remove and delete it, or we can select the foreground that we want to keep. And either way will work, and we'll kind of do both in a way. All right, so if you remember from last time, we have our Select tab in the menu, right up here at the top, Select. And we have our selection tools, these three over here on the sidebar. So we'll start with the Select tab. Right now, we don't have much to choose from. What we do have is all, and you can see I just deselected what all will give me, so we could reselect that, but that's not going to do much. So if we hit all, it selects the entire photograph, and that doesn't really help us. Everything in here is selected, and we can't really do much with that. So that's not going to work, so we'll deselect that. We can use the reselect once we have a selection made, but again, that's just our all, that doesn't work. We could go down here to color range, and this tool will come in handy later on. Basically, we have this preview of what's going to be selected. If I click over here on the background and go to white, a lot of the background is selected, which is pretty great. So let's see what happens. Well, our problem here is that a lot of what's selected is also in the spoons, and then it didn't select any of this red or green down here. So that's a pretty useful tool to select the color range that you want, but it's a little too broad of a brush to paint with, so to speak, for what we're trying to do here and just getting rid of the background. So that tool will come in handy later on in other tutorials, but this one, not quite good enough for us. So let's go ahead and deselect that. Our options, the rest of us in here, nothing that's really going to be all that useful for us at this stage. So let's move on from the Select tab, and we'll go and start playing around with our tools. So here's our rectangular marquee tool, and it's pretty basic. Can't really do much. I could get closer than selecting everything. I can move this around now. That doesn't really help. If you're wondering how I'm getting rid of my selections, it's Command D if you're using a Mac. If you're using a Windows box, I'm not 100% sure what the hotkey is. It's something similar, but you'll have to just look it up. And the way you can look up hotkeys is if you go into your tabs, deselect, this will show you what the hotkey is right here. So if you're ever wondering, that's where you can find those. So again, marquee tool, I can get close to what I need, but obviously I don't need a small rectangle. I need a pretty intricate looking shape. That's not gonna work. Elliptical marquee tool, same thing, gets me close, but not what I want. All right, we'll go down here to the Lasso tools. So we have the Lasso tool, the Polygon Lasso tool, and the Magnetic Lasso tool. All of these are pretty cool, but they're pretty tricky. Now, if you're wondering, I am using a mouse. So to use the Lasso tool, you have to click and hold, and then you have to trace. Now, using a mouse is pretty tough. So we can cut through there. We can start to do that. Start tracing our spoons. But the second I let go of my mouse, it makes a selection. And that's very frustrating because once I start clicking again, it makes a new selection, which is not going to work because I don't think I could make it around the entire board with any accuracy in one shot, holding down the mouse button while I do it. That would just be really hard. So that's not going to work either. So you go to the polygon lasso tool. This one's a little bit easier. You can click and you can drag this. I'm not holding the mouse button down at all right now. I can go to wherever I want, click again, and that will set a new anchor point. So, but you can only move in straight lines. So to do curves, you just have to click a whole bunch of times. This way is pretty good. We could get most of this done working just with the angles, be as precise or not as we want. This tool, if you just need a pretty good selection, I like this one a lot. To close it up, you just double click. And that will close it if you're far away. The other option, if you clicked and you come back to the point, you'll see this little circle pop up next to your lasso tool. And just click one more time and that will select. If you have the little circle up and you double click, it'll deselect and start a new selection. So just make sure that if the little circle is up, you only click once. Okay, let's move on. We also have the magnetic lasso tool. The magnetic lasso tool, so we click once, we don't have to click again. It will automatically add points in. This tool works because of the contrast in colors. So the more contrasted an image is, the better this tool works. But if you try and cut through something, it won't go straight. It'll like make jagged cut marks. It doesn't always give you what you want. As you can see, it's really hard for me to get the anchor points stuck in there. But that is another option, kind of very similar to the polygon lasso tool and a little bit quicker too. So if we just went all the way around here, get our little circle and we click once, that's the best we've gotten and the fastest that we've gotten so far, which is pretty good. Let's see if we can get it even better. Okay, so the next thing we have is our quick selection tool and our magic wand. Magic wand tool, this does, if you click in this background, it selects that whole like white area, which is kind of nice. But if we click off, it makes new selections. So that doesn't really help us very much. We click in the middle, it only gives us little things, doesn't really do much for us. So unfortunately, we can't really go about making the selections we're gonna want. If we go to our quick selection tool, you can see this one's got that circle icon, and that looks more like a paintbrush. And so that's kind of how this one works, is that you just paint over the area you want. And it starts to select things. Again, using that kind of contrasting color space to make the selections. Now, I've been holding down the tool, the mouse button, this whole time I've been using the tool. If I let go, you'll see that my selection doesn't disappear, but what happens is my brush adds this little plus sign into it. Now, if I click again, we should expect it to make a brand new selection. However, it makes a second selection. The reason that is the quick selection tool automatically changes these icons up here. So this plus, this goes to an add to the selection. So every time I click, it keeps adding to my selection, which is pretty cool. The other cool thing, if we wanted to change this, we come up here to the one that's a little minus, and we say, get rid of things. Well, that's pretty cool. So we can kind of modify our selection to get more and more precise, which is pretty great. Because we're not going to want that. So we're going to have to we could just try and do this. Now, again, this is probably even faster than the magnetic lasso tool. We got pretty good. But what about these three icons up in the top? They would be really useful to have for our other brushes. And if you see, we do have them. So up here in the top left corner, I've switched to the magic wand tool. This is what we were using originally, and we've only got one selection made. Well, if I click over here to the additive tool, I can click the spoon, and I can click another spoon, and I can just start clicking stuff, and it'll keep adding. I can do this second one, which anything I click inside my previous selection will now disappear, which is also pretty cool. So if I went here and did my quick selection tool, and I got pretty close to everything I wanted. Let's see here. So I got pretty close to everything I wanted. I can then go to my polygon lasso tool and change the settings again. Down here, I want to get rid of this red area. So I'm going to select remove selection, and I'm going to click outside the box, come into my selection, click around my tools, my spoons, start clicking. I'll click outside, around, and now that's all removed. So what's kind of nice here is, let's say I want to get rid of this. I want to be a little bit more precise even. And I want to get something that's going to look like my spoon board without these pictures. Great. I can deselect that. I want to do the same thing over here. Pretty close anyway. Great. That's all there. You can spend as much or as little time as you want making these selections using these tools. All right. Okay. So that's pretty good. Now let's go back up to the select tool. We got a couple more options that are useful here. So the one I want to see is this save selection. We can save that selection, this document, select our channel. We can give it a name, let's say spoon board, and hit OK. All right, so what do we deselect? All right, well, I just spent some time working. I did whatever, load selection, and I want this, I want spoon board. Say OK, look, it's all back, which is pretty cool. If I were to make a quick transformation, let's say I took my move tool and I moved this. I just want to see what happens. We can go to load selection, channel, we can click spoon board, hit OK, and that selection we had made is back up on the screen. So that could be useful if you want to select a shape of something else and then apply that shape selection to a different layer or something like that. All right, let's back up a couple ways. Cool. The other option we have, if we, make a mistake, you can reselect, which is pretty useful. Okay, so now we have this spoon board selected. I'm going to change this from a background layer to a regular layer so that I can modify it. So I'm going to double click on background, and then I'm going to hit enter. Now it will be called layer 0, which is pretty useful because now I can change the background more free. I can change this image more freely than if it was saved as my background layer. Okay, well, I want to get rid of the background, like I said. So I've got a couple options for doing that. If I just hit delete now, our spoon board goes away. We want the opposite of that. Well, if we want the opposite of that, we can come up here to select, hit inverse, and you'll see that the marquee is on the outside and where we had it. So it's reversed what's been selected. Rather than the spoon board being selected, now everything else is selected. If I hit delete, I'm left with just my spoon board. That's what I want. We have, I deselected. So we want to go back to select and reselect, useful tool. And then we want to undo all of that so that we have this. Because I just want to show you another thing we can do. Okay, so now that we're back to here, if we have one of our lasso tools selected and we right click, we get this option up in here. So we can deselect it, select the inverse, which is another way of selecting the inverse if you don't want to go to the tab. You can save the selection, make a work path. You can do all sorts of things with masking, feathering. What we want to do is we have these layer via copy and layer via cut. So I have the background selected and I do layer via copy. Okay, and doesn't really look like anything happened except I could turn off the foreground or the layer 0 and I'm still left with my background. For us, that doesn't really help any. So if I do Command Z and rather I select, so let's see if that didn't help us, let's do layer via cut. Okay, now if you look closely, there's a line in here and we have 2 separate layers. Now I can turn off layer 0 and get rid of that, but I can also turn off layer 1. This is useful if you want the 2 different layers, and let's say you just want to change the opacity of the back of one of those layers to work with other things. That would be more useful if you're making digital prints. But the other thing we can do now is we have layer 1 and layer 0. We'll just get rid of layer 1. That would also work. Let's see, we'll step backwards a couple times here. If we wanted to select via inverse, now if we used layer via copy, since our board was selected, if I turn off layer 0, I have another copy of the layer 1, which is just the spoon board. So these different things can be kind of useful. All right, we'll step backwards a couple times and we'll go over a few more selection tools before we move along further in this tutorial. Okay, so now that we just have our spoon board, we're gonna wanna make this transformation. Right now you can see it's kind of crooked and it looks a little bit weird, and I want this to be a spoon board floating on a white background when it's a final print. I can see it in my head, and I need to kind of change things around so that these aren't in this weird distortion. Otherwise I have to have my dad resend me the photograph from all the way in New York and retake it, and that'll just take a while. So I can kind of just go and fix things around. So if we take our guides, remember, click and drag out from the ruler, we can start putting them and playing around with them. Now let's make this a little bit easier to see and create a new layer, and we'll get the paint bucket and we'll fill our layer in white. Okay, great. So we can drag out our other guides, line them up. That side's pretty straight, which is pretty good. And then let's see about this. Okay, that looks a bit crooked. That one's pretty good. That one's also a bit crooked. And that one's a bit crooked too. So we'll see how well we can do with this. So a couple of different ways we can do this here. We go up to edit and we come down here in our transforms. We got a couple different ones. I like this free transform personally, but you can do a couple different things. You can do transform scale, where we can start to play around dragging and dropping different things, make things bigger and wider. So here, if you want this to set, you can either press enter or this check mark. If you're not happy with it, you can cancel it and it will cancel for you. More of these: rotate, skew, distort. Some of them are a little bit more self-explanatory. We're not going to use any of these right now. Feel free to play around with them, but for what we're trying to accomplish, this will be pretty tricky. So let's go up here to free transform, also Command T if you're using a Mac, and you get this free transform, which at the beginning looks almost exactly like what we were just doing. What's nice with this, if you hold down Command and you go to one of these boxes in the corners of the sides, you can drag around that corner freely. So what I like about this is we can, if our image was like that originally, we can take this corner, drag it out and line it up with that guide, and then we can start to stretch it so that that looks pretty good on the bottom. Now the problem with that is our second from the bottom rack doesn't look so good, so we're gonna just have to kind of split the difference here maybe a little bit and call that good. We can start dragging this down. That starts to look okay. Kind of happy with that. Let's get another ruler and we'll see. I think the bottom would be more important. That looks pretty good. This one up here is not so great. Let's drag a ruler down. Top looks okay, but let's see what happens if we did this. That looks okay too. And I think once we drag that one up and make the top pretty good, it does a pretty good job of evening out the rest of the stuff. We could use this bottom one down here maybe a little bit. That looks pretty good. Everything's starting to look kind of where we want it. Drop that down a bit. And I'd say that's all right. You know, if we wanted it to be perfect, that's kind of where you gotta, take more time in the photographing process. But for when you get a pretty quick Google picture or something that someone else has sent you to use, I'd say that's a pretty good way of doing it, is just kind of skewing your photograph in Photoshop like this. So I'm gonna say, okay. And because this now looks really confusing, I'm going to get rid of my guides by just dragging them up into the ruler that they came from, and they'll all disappear. Okay, great. So at this point, it looks pretty good. We've dragged the corners. We've got this looking more straight on with everything being nice and cleaned up and looking like a spoon board that we're looking at. So at this point is probably where I called it when I went and made this my digital sketch. And I probably just took this and printed it out and coated the back with red iron oxide, traced it onto a stone, and started the drawing process. We're going to go a little bit further because let's say you need to be able to see a little bit better. I'll click on this magnifying glass and we'll go down here. And this is where I wanted to show the clone stamping tool. It's this one right here. It's a brush. It looks like a brush. The cool thing about the clone stamping tool is if you hold down the Option key, it changes, and it lets you set a reference point. So if we go back here, set our reference point, now you can see I've got this brown shape that I can paint with. That what it does, you see that just happened. So if I make my brush a little bit smaller, be a little bit easier to control, wherever that plus symbol is above our brush is what's gonna paint. So if I move that plus over onto the fork, I'm just gonna recolor the fork. Same with the spoon. Same with that line. So you can clone a part of your drawing. Let's say I wanted to put the mini spoon over here. I would just click mini with Option hold, and then I would just paint her in. And I could duplicate that spoon, which is kind of cool. But that's not what we're here to do. We're here to get rid of some of this extra stuff that we didn't want originally. This takes some time. This takes some time, as you can see. And the other part is you want to do your best to move around that reference point. Otherwise, it's gonna look a bit funny as you just start to kind of reproduce the image on top of itself over and over again. I'll spend a little bit of time doing this just so everyone can see what it will look like at the end, and then I'll speed up through that so that you don't have to sit here and watch me do this whole thing. Okay, so what I've realized here is that the clone stamp tool is not going to be great for getting rid of all these photographs. What I would do here is just probably switch to an actual brush tool, grab a color that's close enough, and maybe just quickly paint things over if you wanted to draw this in. And get things ready. Once you do that, then you can start drawing things in. So I'll finish up with that, and then we'll see where we're at. Okay, so I'm going to call that good enough for our purposes. But what we could do to get this top shape here is we can continue using our selection tools and kind of use some of the stuff we've already gone over. Let's see. I'm just going to select this, making sure layer 1's selected. And I'm going to say layer via copy. Okay. Now, if I turn off everything so you can see what's going on, I've got this board. Okay. I'm going to reduce the opacity of this so that we can see where my good layer is and where my extra layer is. I'm going to click on layer 3 and I'm going to go up to our transform tab and I'm going to say, I don't know, flip vertical. Why not? I can then drag this up and maybe let's make that one a little bit less opaque too, so you can see how they blend over each other. Start to line these up. Oop, not the one I wanted. Always make sure to select the correct layer. And I could, line those up something like this. That's pretty good. From here, I could then select my layer 1, grab my paintbrush, and finish painting in a shape that I wanted. And kind of use that as a little tracing. I doubt that's going to look very good because of how quickly I did it. Yeah, it's okay. But that's another thing you can do is like start giving yourself guides with those transformation tools. Cool. We'll call that pretty good, or at least good enough for what we need. Okay, so now that we're done clone stamping, we've gotten rid of our dollar sign, our dollar bill, and our pictures and our measuring tape. We've got this pretty much where we want. I know that what I did at this point is just printed it out and started tracing. And as a printmaker, you gotta remember every single time to flip your image horizontally. Otherwise, like me, you'll get halfway into the tracing and realize all your words are correct, which means they will print backwards from your stone or woodcut or whatever. So if you are using this kind of the way I do to make sketches for your traditional printing, always make sure to go up here, edit, transform, flip horizontal. That'll be super important. Okay, so from here, like I said, we can print this out. We can coat the back of it in red iron oxide, and then we can trace that onto a wood block and start carving. We can trace it onto an etching plate and start scratching through hard ground to make an etching, or we can do what I did, which is trace it onto a stone, and then we can use our crayons to do a finished drawing. So this isn't the finished product. This is just the thing I used to get me towards the finished product, which I believe is this. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial, and we'll see you again next week.